William Bridge's Congregationalist colleague, John Owen. And so we're looking really both sessions will be in the 17th century, that period of time that Christopher Hill once described as a world turned upside down, and so on. My suspicion then is that having come here this morning to take in subjects like that, you have an interest in history. I'm not really trying to then cultivate something that's not there. I'm speaking, as it were, to the choir. But it may be helpful to go over again why it is that we spend time thinking about history. Our culture, although it is interested in history as a vehicle of entertainment, as a context in which you can go for 2 hours and watch a rendition, for instance, of my favorite 19th century author, Jane Austen, one of her novels, or some other event from the past, and it serves as a way of escape, maybe from some of the challenges of reality. I think the truth can be said, though, that Western culture is not fascinated by history, in the sense of history is not a place that Western culture, be it on my side of the Atlantic, be it over here, turns to for regularly wisdom. In Ontario, where I happen to reside, I see this quite clearly demonstrated in the fact that one can go through what we call high school, secondary school, and take in the course of 4 years, 1 half-term in history. And that's all you need to get what is called a secondary school graduation diploma. And so out of maybe, something like 40 subjects, only 1 in history is required. That's a slippage. When I first went to Canada, we had to take about 8 history courses. But I think it reflects, I'm not sure what the situation is here at all, but I think that reflects something of a mindset that what is important is the present and the future. And the subjects that are really emphasized are those in the sciences, technology, etc. And our culture, I think, then, is very much one in which history, as I said, may be an interesting form of diversion, entertainment, but it's certainly not a place I'm going to go for wisdom. I think far too many of people in our culture have the attitude of one of Jane Austen's heroines in Northanger Abbey, Catherine Morland, who is the heroine of that kind of takeoff of Gothic literature, has a little speech about history. And she says this: "History tells me nothing that does not either vex or weary me." And she goes on to talk about how it's simply the story of popes and kings and battles and not a woman to be seen anywhere. And that's an amazing statement, because that's at the very outset of modernity and the modern age. And I think Jane Austen has well captured how culture was moving. It's strange to think that the late Georgian world, the Victorian world, was beginning to think that. And but I think whether or not she's accurate about her day, it certainly is, I think, ideal, kind of an ideal quote about our day. There are certain parts of the West that don't encourage history. This building is not one of them. You come into this building and you're immediately thrust into the context of history. You just can't fail to think about the men and women over the generations who've sat where you've sat and the worship of God that has gone on. In North America, there are large, in many of our large cities, you see nothing but the last buildings from the last 30, 40, 50 years. And there's no stimulus to think about history. Now, if that's true of our culture in broad strokes, I think it's also true, sadly, of the church. And tragically, there are many Christians, evangelical Christians who love the Scriptures and who love their Savior, who really aren't interested in history. There is a denominational body in North America, I won't name them,
which have a ruling among their churches. They're a flourishing body of churches, fairly recent in origin. There's about 150 of these congregations. The largest congregation, which is in the Chicago area, this might give you a clue as to the group I'm talking about, is probably around 10,000, 12,000 in membership. For a long period of time, I think this might be changing, they had a rule they would not sing a hymn older than 25 years. Why is that? Well, the argument was those people are speaking a different language. It looks like English, sounds like English, but it really isn't. It's not a language where we're able to converse with, and we need to be current and, quote, relevant. And I find that perspective horrifying. As a historian, yes, but also because for most people who come to a congregational setting of worship the Lord's Day after Lord's Day, the only contact they have with the past is the hymnody. I don't expect that they're going home to read Richard Sibbes or William Bridge or John Owen on a Sunday afternoon, but I hope that they've had some contact with the past through the hymnody. And that really, as you think of it, if the culture in which we're living in is one in which there is little interest in history as a source of wisdom and direction, when Christians embrace that attitude, really that is worldliness. And I think, to some degree, sinfulness. One of the great challenges, and I'm not going to pursue this theme more, I'm going to get into specific reasons why we need to study church history. One of the great challenges you find in Scripture is really what we might call a theology of remembrance. Remember. And you have that word that comes up again and again and again. In fact, the prophets, both major and minor prophets as we call them, are really theologians of remembrance. They're calling Israel to go back to Mount Sinai and to think about the covenant that they made with God. We again, on the Lord's Day, remember those great acts that God has done in the person of our Lord Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, crucified for sinners, raised from the dead, ascended to heaven, seated at the right hand of the Father. These are acts in space and time, as it were, historical acts. Even down to the point where Jesus says, remember Lot's wife. He assumes you're familiar with the story in Genesis, and you can take that story and apply it to the present day. And so there is in Holy Scripture a theology of remembrance. But let me give you a number of reasons why I think Christians should study history. And what is important to note, and I'm not going to get into this except for maybe at one point, is also the recognition we don't live in the past. So what I'm not recommending is antiquarianism, some sort of escapism to the past. I have a friend in the United States who is a reenactor. I know you have them over here. They reenact the Civil War. I'd be fascinated actually to go to one of those reenactments. But he's a reenactor in the Confederate Army, and I sometimes think I get the impression he'd like to have lived back there in the 1860s. That's not what I'm recommending. I'm not recommending some sort of antiquarianism. When I was a young boy growing up in England, one of the shows that I remember very vividly, I've been thinking in recent days about what was it that impacted me, that gave me a love of history from a very, very early age. I had a father who is a scientist, and who, when I decided to go into history, church history, was quite concerned. It wasn't his cup of tea. He didn't see any future in it. As he once said to a friend of his, there's just no money in that. And I know I didn't get the love of history from him. I might have got it from my mother. She's with the Lord. She died very young at the age of 43. In Ireland, she had... the Irish are very in love with their history. And so maybe it was from her. But one of the things I do remember very vividly, in the BBC in the 1960s, ran a series of programs on William Shakespeare's history plays. Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, Henry V, Henry VI Part 1, Henry VI Part 2, and Richard III, on the Wars of the Roses. And I remember being fascinated with that. And as a young boy, I didn't like living in the mid-20th century, and I thought, man, wouldn't it have been great just to have lived back there? And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about any sort of antiquarianism, escapism. God, in his providence, has given us life and breath in the late 20th century, early 21st century. We must live and be faithful in this context. But how does history help us in that way? Well, first of all, history has meaning. The meaning of our lives is found in history. It's very difficult to think for any length of time ahistorically or atemporally. You know, our whole verb system is built around past, present, future. In English, we don't have any atemporal verbs. Greek actually does. It has the thing called the aorist, which for many years Greek scholars didn't realize that this verb really doesn't have so much context with time as much with type of action. But in English, our whole verb system is built around time. When people no longer remember the past, their own personal past, the sense of identity disappears. I'm sure all of you know people who have been ravaged by forms of dementia. And when it becomes serious enough and they no longer recognize family and friends, they're in a position where they no longer really function properly. What happens when churches experience dementia? When Christian communities experience dementia? When they have no idea where they've come from? I think that gives them they start to fail to understand who they are. And there is a loss to some degree of a sense of meaning. God is active. This is still the same point. God is active in history. We confess that. Of all the religions apart from Judaism, Christianity is deeply, deeply historical. If you know anything about Buddhism and Hinduism, you'll know that history for them is a realm to escape. And history is illusion. For a long time, until I started to read the Quran seriously, I thought Islam was part and parcel of that kind of historical strain. You've got Judaism, Christianity, and then Islam as a heresy coming out of Christianity, and that Islam was deeply historical. What's amazing, if you read the Quran, it's hardly historical at all. You can't put together a life of Muhammad in it. It really is a group of sayings more than anything. Christianity, though, is deeply historical. We confess that God, maker of heaven and earth, created Adam and Eve in space-time reality. We confess that this God has acted in history. We think particularly of the call of Abraham. There is an individual who is Abraham. We confess that there is the leading of the people of Israel out of Egypt into the Promised Land, the establishment of the kingdom, the histories of the kingdom, and so on. I mean, you can't read the Old Testament, and you're flooded with history. And then the New Testament is the same. We confess that the second person of the Godhead entered into space and time and took on humanity, that he acted in history. He was crucified in space and time. That's critical to our confession. It's very interesting. I don't know if you've ever thought of this. When you go through the Nicene Creed, where it says he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, what struck me in the last year or so, what on earth is a Roman pagan governor doing in a Christian creed? Crucified under Pontius Pilate. Like, what on earth is he doing there? Well, at one level, it is a confession that what we're talking about is an historical event that took place at a certain point in time during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was procurator of Judea. His resurrection, I won't go into this. This has obviously been this is a big debated issue during the course of the 20th century. Rudolf Bultmann, the famous German liberal theologian, at one point indicated that If we found the bones of Jesus in Israel today, and we could prove they were the bones of Jesus, it wouldn't make any difference to the Christian faith. Well, it's amazing when a scholar says that. Here are men who think they know the Scriptures. Well, 1 Corinthians 15, I think, is very clear. If Christ is not risen from the dead, that is risen in space and time, historically. If the resurrection is not an historical event, well, we might as well pack the whole thing in and go home. So God is active in history. Now, obviously the challenge, once you leave the inspired account of the Scriptures and you move out into church history around the year 100, and then we've had the last 1900 years, tracing God's activity in history. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Civil War period. Well, it's going to occupy us a little bit with William Bridge and John Owen. And both Owen and Bridge were very convinced that God was doing certain providential things which later evangelicals and historians might question. The execution of Charles I, for example, which John Owen was clearly convinced was an absolute necessity if England was going to experience true Reformation. Was that providential in the sense of God, that was an act of God that was in part God's providential plan, and that the Puritans had read that properly? My point being here is whatever side you come down on, and I have great admiration for Oliver Cromwell, I hope I can say that in a building like this, in a congregational setting. When I'm in Ireland, I normally don't mention the name of Oliver Cromwell. Even though it's fascinating, the church that we work with in Ireland was founded by Cromwellian troops in 1649. They just conveniently never talk about it. But Cromwell, if you read Cromwell, he has a very strong providential view of history until he becomes the Lord Protector. And then it becomes much more difficult for him to read what is God doing in history. During the Civil Wars, after the Battle of Marston Moor and the Battle of Naseby, and then Dunbar and Worcester, all these remarkable victories that Cromwell participated in, it was very clear what God was doing. God was vindicating the rights of the Puritans and Parliament. Once he became the ruler of England, it was much more murky. My point is this, is that God is active in history, but it's not always easy for historians to determine exactly what is God doing. I'm going to throw this question out. I'm not going to answer it. The history of Britain, the history of England in the 20th century and early 21st century, the First World War, the Second World War, the advent of the 1960s, which is a watershed, the successive issues that you've been challenged with politically, the current Brexit event. What is God doing in all that? Is he active in that? Yes, I think we have to affirm that. But it's not easy to know necessarily exactly how God is acting. But God is active. Not a sparrow falls to the ground, Jesus says, but the Father knows that. And I think if you think about your own life, the meaning of your own life, the events of your life, they have significance for you because God is there. God is active. I think you either prayed that or talked about that earlier. We confess the presence of God in our lives. He is there in the daily mundane events, and sometimes those events take on completely new directions because of one providential meeting. But we can't always read the big picture. So, history has meaning. Our personal lives has meaning because God is active in them. And I think, therefore, we should study history because of that. Secondly, history gives a sense of humility. We are historical beings. We owe so much to those who've gone before. one of the past editors of the American journal Christianity Today was a man named Gilbert Beers, felt like beers. And he said, we owe much to many whom we've never met. We owe much to many whom we've never met. And he goes on to say, we live in a throwaway society. We still are that way. Thankfully, I think we should be thankful for this. In the last probably 10 to 20 years, there's been a greening of Western culture. Now, some of it's wacky, I know, but much of it is good. I mean, the amount of trash that we throw away, etc., we should be concerned about these things. But we live in a culture that disposes of enormous amounts of stuff. And Beers says, my fear is that we throw away our predecessors on the garbage dump along with all the other stuff we throw out. I think this is certainly a fault of younger people. I mean, I've been a history teacher now since 1982, and one of the things I've discovered is that the older my students are, generally the more interested and serious they are about history. I teach a fair number of PhD students, and the average age is around 35 to 40. There's an interest there that I don't find in early 20-year-olds, normally. And as one gets older, one gets a deeper sense of what we owe to the past. Jesus said in John 4, others have labored, and you've entered into their labor. I mentioned a little bit about my conversion. It took place at a church called Stanley Avenue Baptist Church in Hamilton, Ontario. I don't expect anybody's heard of it. It was founded in the 1870s as a mission, Sunday school mission, and then in time it was able to establish itself as a congregation. I came there in 1973. I was a 19-year-old, politically very strongly left-wing. I was coming out of my Marxism, but there was a lot of that still there. I was interested in God, Zen Buddhism and Taoism and transcendental meditation. Some of you may remember the Maharishi Yogi, the kind of mentor of George Harrison of the Beatles. And that sort of thing fascinating. I could talk about God. I was doing a philosophy in BA. You mentioned the presence of God. I remember coming into the congregation had gone through a period of revival, a mini revival, and there was a sense of the presence of God. And I thought I knew God. I could talk about him, but it was a philosophical concept. It's a completely different thing to be in the presence of the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the Lord Jesus Christ. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. When I used to come into the church, there was an elderly woman there named Lottie Inrig, spinster, unmarried. She was part of that generation. We didn't lose as many men in the First World War as you did, but we lost many, many young men. Part of that generation of women who grew up in the First World War years, and an entire generation of men were wiped out, and she never married. She was quiet. She must have been in her 80s when I first started going there. I'm 19. 19-year-olds don't normally relate to 80-year-olds. That's sad in our culture. It really is sad. As I've gotten older, I realize how important it is that their relationships be developed between older Christians and younger Christians. And that older Christians, I think, have a responsibility to build those relationships with younger Christians. But anyway, I never paid her much attention. And then about 10 years later, and she may or may not have been living still, I forget, I was asked to write a small history of the church, a local history. And I remember going through the minute books, and in the 1920s, 1925, 1927, Baptists in Ontario went through a huge theological battle. It was over one school, McMaster University, where my father was teaching, and the Divinity College there. And the Divinity College was increasingly liberal. And the battle was over the gospel. And I came across a minute, 1926, where Lottie Enright, I'd never heard her say a word, never, stood up at a business meeting. She would only been about 25. And she said, I'd like to move a motion that we as a church cut off funding to the Divinity School until they come back to preaching the gospel. And that passed. And those churches that took that sort of stand in the 20s were still gospel churches in the 80s, 70s and 80s. Those churches that generally didn't, within 2 generations, had lost the gospel. And what I suddenly realized was how much I owed to a woman like Lottie Inrig. Her name's not in any history book. And we are thankful that God knows those histories. I'm the older I get and the more I've studied history, I'm quite certain that history from his standpoint is quite different from our histories. And the figures who we think are the giants may not be as prominent, and the people we've never heard of, like a Lottie Inrig, may assume much greater roles. And it was a very humbling experience. And I think one of the great things we need to grow in as Christians is humility. And I realized how much I owed to faithful men and women who came week after week and prayed and gave and stood for the gospel. Thirdly, history liberates us from the tyranny of the present. This point I get from C.S. Lewis. Lewis, in his introduction to Athanasius on the Incarnation of the Word, talks about how every age has its own outlook. And these are his words. It's especially good at seeing certain truths, especially liable to make certain mistakes. We all therefore need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our period. That means the old books. All contemporary writers, even to those who share to some extent, all contemporary writers share to some extent the contemporary outlook, even those like myself who seem most opposed to it. What we need is the only palliative of the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. And this can be only done by reading old books. Not, of course, he says that there's any magic about the past. If we had the books of the future, they'd be just as good. What we need is a point that is different from ours. And it's amazing how you go back into the past and you find two figures of the same generation completely at odds with each other, but at certain levels they agree on certain basic things that everybody agrees on in the past. Let me give you one example. I'm going to do a little kind of quiz here. I'm going to mention a word which was frequently on the mind of a figure of the past, Francis of Assisi. And I want you to think of what word comes to your mind, whether liberty or bondage. Okay? And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but... So the word is, remember, liberty or bondage. What word first comes to mind? The word is poverty. Liberty or bondage. I sometimes do this with church history survey classes, and usually 2/3 of the class to 3/4 of the class, they'll say bondage. There'll always be a few who say liberty, but most of them say bondage. I expect that, because in Western culture, poverty is not seen as something that frees us. It's seen as something that binds and restricts us. For Francis, poverty is something to be wed. He talks about marrying Lady Poverty. Now, is he right? That's another question. That's not as a historian, that's not my first port of call. My first port of call is to understand the past and to recognize he confronts me with something that's different. And then what confronts me then is maybe my perspective on poverty is not as biblical as I think it is. He forces me to go back to the past and to go back to Scripture. And there's a great little. This one's a bit more humorous and not as maybe weighty. In the 1870s, C.H. Spurgeon, the great Victorian Baptist preacher, had a visiting preacher from the United States, a man named Pentecost. There were actually two men's last names, Pentecost, interesting last name. And they both lived and worked in New York City. And he had this one man over. He'd heard of him, and he had him for a week of holiness meetings, preaching on sanctification. And the week was a great week until the final day, the final evening, when Mr. Pentecost gave up and he was going to give his, practical kind of application of much of what he'd done that week. And he chose for his subject, he should have researched this a little bit more, he chose for his subject smoking. And he went on for about 10 minutes. And, one of the marks of holiness is you don't smoke. That vile, addictive habit. Well, most of the congregation knew that Mr. Spurgeon loved to have a cigar now and then. Spurgeon got up to thank the man, thanked him for a great week in the Word of God and so on. But he said on one point, he knew the congregation knew that he would obviously differ on him, and he felt he had to come clean. He said on one point, dear Reverend Pentecost, I need to differ from you, and that is on your application that you've just made on smoking. And he said, in fact, that afternoon, this is all recorded in the newspapers, that afternoon I'm going to go home and smoke a cigar to the glory of God. And you suddenly confront him with something, it's very different, When Robert Hall Jr., who you may or may not know, probably the Spurgeon of an earlier generation, he was a celebrity. In the 1820s, whenever people would, a place like this, which could hold, about 800, I would think? 800 to 1,000, maybe? Maybe I'm a bit over. It would be jammed to the rafters if Robert Hall was here. They'd have to open the windows, there'd be people outside, and so on. He was a celebrity preacher. He had a nervous breakdown at one point, and his doctor told him to do two things. Number one, you got to get married. And so he married his housekeeper. And number two, he needed to take up smoking. Well, he did both, and it cured him. I mean, I think we know pretty well what smoking does to people today. And you suddenly realize it's a different world. And it forces you to think maybe some of the attitudes, and I'm not recommending you all go out and smoke. What I am recommending is that when I was first converted as a Baptist, well, there were a number of things that we didn't do. We didn't dance, we didn't go to movies, we didn't drink, and we didn't smoke. And you didn't date those who do. And you suddenly realize that, okay, that certainly couldn't have been a cardinal rule in the 19th century. And you suddenly realize maybe some of the things that we hold to be so important maybe are not as important. And maybe some of our attitudes are different. Now, what's critical about this is the realization that the past is a foreign country. That phrase is not unique to me. It's a line from a novel. It begins a novel. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Most of my travel, it sounds like I do a lot of travel, is pretty well in English, totally in English-speaking countries. Last summer, my wife and I, my wife's Scottish, we're over here pretty well every year. All of her family are over here. Most of my Irish family are over here. We had never been to the European continent. I mean, I grew up here in Britain in the 60s and would not have regarded myself as European. And because my daughter's in Vienna, working there, we decided to go to Europe for the first time. And the realization that I had was it's very different. And coming here, I mean, I feel at home in the culture. I grew up here. I understand it. But the past it's a foreign culture. Even the past in England. They do things differently there. That is helpful. That is enormously helpful. Because what it does is it forces you to realize that maybe some of the ways that we do things are simply cultural and not scriptural. It's always amazing to me how much of what we take for granted as scriptural is really just cultural. And former ages, they did things differently. So the study of the past frees us from the tyranny of the present, not only the tyranny of the nonsense of the present, but even some of the ways in which our church life is hidebound by the culture that we've maybe developed in the last 50, 7,500 years. And then, and I think I'm on, is this fourth or fifth point? Fourth. Models for imitation. One of the reasons why you studied history in the ancient world was to find out how to live. We don't do that today. I've taught enough in the academic world to know that the academic history is not designed to teach you how to live. But that's not the way our forebears thought of history. If you read Luke's intro to his gospel, and then into the book of Acts, the reason why he presents models in there, and he has Paul, Stephen, Philip, Apollos. These are men whom he hopes his readers will to some degree emulate. In fact, Paul can say, imitate me. And so there is a place, as long as we remember, these were men with clay feet like us. But having said that, some of these men and women are remarkable figures who can help us enormously. I'm a Canadian. I was born in England, but went early enough when I was 12, 13 years old to Canada to become pretty thoroughly Canadianized. I realize that when I come back to England, and little things are different. And Canadian evangelicals are wimpish. We're not like the Americans. The Americans are in your face. You know what they believe. They don't hide back. They don't keep back their emotions. Canadians tend to keep our emotions to ourselves. We've lived in a political context where we've had to compromise with the French. Britain conquered North America in 1759, 1760, at the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it's called in North America. And the British government that was established in the Canadas decided to allow the French to retain language, church, and law. So in Quebec, they have civil law. Technically, it's the French language is the legal language. They don't have to put any signage in English. And the church, up until the 1960s, was the dominant political institution. And to make Canada work, the English in Canada have had to work in that. They've had to compromise. And that has shaped our character. And it's very interesting reading Canadian evangelicalism, how deeply compromised we are on many issues. And so it's very helpful for me to read about one figure in the 18th century, one of my heroes in the 18th century, William Grimshaw, who was an Anglican cleric in the village of Haworth in Yorkshire. Very famous, second most visited literary kind of pilgrimage place in Britain, because it's where the Bronte sisters grew up. And they've actually got, in the manse, the old manse, they've got a museum to the Brontes. I remember going through it. I'm not into the Brontes. I find them kind of depressing. I do understand that topography and context shapes you, and living out in the moors, the Yorkshire moors, in the early 19th century, I think could be depressing. It's a difficult town to get to even today. No offense to anybody here who loves the Brontes. The very fact I said Jane Austen was my favorite 19th century novelist will kind of tell you that the Brontes kind of novel is not going to be appealing to me necessarily. So I'm a historian. I love history. I went through the museum. And it was very well done. Nothing on Grimshaw. This man who, when he came to the town in the early 1740s at the parish church of St. Michael and All Angels, found 12 people in a congregational setting that could seat over 1,000. 12 people received the Lord's Supper. 6 years later, in the summer, there were 6,000, week after week. They all weren't in the church. The church was jammed to the rafters. They had to put a platform up that went out through one of the windows, and he would walk back and forth preaching to about 5,000 out in the cemetery. And it transformed Haworth. Haworth became a center of remarkable spiritual awakening and revival. And so I went there to really kind of find something of that. I went to the church. That was very disappointing. There was a couple of little things about William Grimshaw, a plaque like the one you have here of his name on it. At the back of the church, I expected to find some booklets on him. All they were was booklets on Benny Hinn, which was very interesting. And so I go through the museum. I expect to find something there. There's nothing there except right at the end. There's this, maybe there is now, but there is a glass case with a teapot and a little sign. This was Mr. William Grimshaw's teapot. And they had a little thing, he was the minister here, so. And then it said, and I'm really thankful for this, it said, the front side you could see, it was Mr. William Grimshaw's teapot. The back you couldn't see, but it said on the back was Grimshaw's favorite verse. To me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And when Grimshaw became the minister, he had that put over one of the head, kind of the sounding board in his pulpit. And he lived that. He would regularly go out in violation of Anglican polity, preach in other men's parishes, regularly get beaten up by mobs that neighboring ministers raised to stop him. And just a remarkable, we don't have time to go into all of the details. Faith Cook has written a very fabulous book called Grimshaw of Haworth. And to me, as a Canadian evangelical shaped by my political culture, which is wimpish to some degree, William Grimshaw's life is a good kick in the pants. That there are times in which we must be forthright for the gospel, whatever our culture says. And then there's one final reason, and that is the praise of God. This year is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And there are some evangelicals on our side of the Atlantic. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some here who are bemoaning what happened then. It was a disastrous split Christendom, split Christianity. It's led to a multiplicity of sects, etc. But surely, from the point of view of someone who loves the Scriptures and loves the gospel, the rediscovery of the gospel, how an individual who is a sinner, man, woman, child, can find peace with a holy God and find a place to understand who God is, what God is about in this world, namely Holy Scripture. Surely, from that point of view, the Reformation is an act of God. I look back at the 18th century I just mentioned. The 18th century, just a remarkable era of revival and renewal. And we thank God for it. And so, remembering the past is a vehicle for praising God in the present, but also giving us a hunger that God might do these things again. We serve a great God. His arm is not shortened. And the West has faced massive problems before, and God has acted for our good. Oh, that he might do so again, that he might hear the prayers of his people, no matter how small they might be in numbers, that he might act on their behalf again and do great things, and that his enemies might be scattered. Thank you. Let me repeat the questions for the recording. So the question was, is a purpose of history then the Augustinian view that history is a time of preparation for heaven? Yes, I think so. I didn't intend that the reasons I gave be exhaustive. There's probably another 4 or 5 that you could easily look at. But I certainly think that history is a place where God is preparing his people. So you think of your own individual life. Your life is a journey towards a goal, namely the city of God, to use Augustinian terms. And sanctification then is preparing us for the beatific vision, again to use Augustinian terms. And if that's true of the individual, how much true then is it of the church? So the church's pilgrimage in history has meaning and purpose as God prepares his people to see their God face to face. That's good. Yeah.
What would be your recommendation for back to the overview of church history? I'm particularly thinking of those who don't read, Christians who don't read much, who don't see what to get a recommendation.
Yeah, there's probably a number. There's a lot of things that have come out in recent days. Nicholas Needham has 4 volumes. I found them, to be honest, a little off-putting initially because of their font. And the recent Christian Focus have really cleaned up the font. They had all kinds of underlining, and it looked just, it didn't look professional. And I'm sorry if I love books, and I think if you're going to go through the bother of printing a book, you should make it appealing. But Nicholas Needham has done a good job, I think, in looking at 4,000 years of church history. He's done 4 volumes, and a 5th is due to come out. The textbook I use is an introduction to the history of Christianity by Timothy Dowley. He's an English writer, editor. And what he does in that book, which I like, is that he goes to the experts in different periods of church history. And again, the more that I've studied church history, just the absolute overwhelming nature. I mean, I teach in a context where we have Old Testament scholars, New Testament scholars, systematic theologians, and historians. And I often say that, especially the New Testament scholars, they have it easy. All they've got is, 27 books and 70 years. We've got 2,000 books, 2,000 years. And then once you get the modern missionary movement and the globalization of Christianity, it is just absolutely overwhelming. And I've begun to realize in the last few years that we are really failing our students in teaching church history because we are not teaching them global Christianity. And the center of Christianity, evangelical Christianity, has shifted from the north and the west to the south and the east, Africa, Asia, maybe South America. And we need to be teaching our students that, as well as Western church history. But Timothy Dowley, what he does is he uses different editors, different writers in different periods who are experts in those periods, and that's a helpful book. I generally am wary of one writer writing the whole history of the church. I couldn't imagine doing it myself. There are different types of historians, it's been said. There are 3 types, generally speaking. There's the guys who are like architects. So when this building was built, presumably there was an architect who drew up the large plan. And then there are the guys who come in and they put a brick on brick with mortar in between. And then there are the guys who actually go out into the quarry and they make the bricks. And I tend to be somewhere between the latter two. I was trained as very big emphasis on detail, and I find it very difficult to step back and look at the big picture. But for people first reading history, I think the big picture is helpful. And but it's a difficult thing to carry off. So there are those ones that I've just mentioned. There's a great book by a man named Jeremy Jackson, if you can find it, called No Other Foundation. It does the whole history of the church in 300 pages. And being a detail guy, I've got quibbles all over the place. But he gets the big picture right, and I think that's helpful. And I think I've had to realize over the years is that the most evangelical Christians, they're not historians per se. They need to know history. And what they need is the big picture. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so it was raised about the importance of hymnody. I think hymnody is a great vehicle for introducing history of the church. I think one of the things that a minister or those leading hymns can do, before they actually sing the hymn, they can say a little bit about it, the author, and the context maybe. Just a minute or two, it can be very easily done, and it whets people's appetite, gives them a sense of the past. I think there's some great hymnody being written today. I mean, I love the Keith and Kristen Getty. I think what they're doing is tremendous. And I have some friends they won't sing anything older than 25 years. I've got other friends who think that God stopped raising up hymn writers around 1920. And we have to avoid both. But I think the bigger problem we have today is the loss of the hymnody. I think that's the bigger challenge for us today.
Well, first of all, Michael, thank you for a riveting excellent. Forgive me, but since my mother died in her early 40s from lung cancer, and she was a heavy smoker, forgive me if I can't get too excited about space. But that aside, would you agree with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said that he who dwells on the past loses the sight of one eye. He who forgets the past loses the sight of both eyes.
Yes.
And isn't really our present problem? I mean, if you preach the scriptures in regular Lord's Day by Lord's Day ministry, you preach divine truth and also divine history. And isn't the lack of that kind of preaching ministry part of the problem? Because if you learn about the wonders of God's truth and grace, you learn in the scriptures his mighty working in history. So an obvious question to a Christian would then be, well, if God did mighty things down to the end of the Acts of the Apostles, what's he going to since? Isn't that perhaps the problem, that the fullness of the biblical revelation, historically and theologically, is not really set out in many churches?
Yeah, I think that's a very helpful comment. And I think that one of the things I've observed over the years is that a lot of the Old Testament is not preached. Well, you have enormous amounts of historical material, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Samuel. The story of David often is, but the rest of the history of the kings of Judah, etc., where you see God's intervention and action in history, which then should force you to realize, well, if he's active then, he's going to be active now. But I think, yes, I think if there is a failure to preach the entire revelation of God and God's activity in history, I mean, that's a fundamental principle of being a Christian, is that God is sovereign Lord of history. History is meaning, and he is active in history. Yeah. But there was a question here, a brother. Yeah.
History is a linear.
Yes.
Sequential events. God is outside of that. To him, 1,000 years is like a day. Did you comment?
Yes, I mean, obviously, God's eternality means that he is not shaped by time in the way we are. in terms of our temporality. We're creatures of time. We get old. We change. That's very obvious. God is not like that in that sense. And yet, on the other hand, in affirming the atemporality of God, his eternality, we also have to affirm that the Incarnation is a model of how God has acted towards history. In the Incarnation, he actually enters into time, takes on human flesh, grows in the womb of Mary as a baby, is born at a point in time. We don't know that exact date. One out of 365 possibilities, it's December the 25th. And we have one story of when he was 12, and then beginning of his ministry, he's crucified in space and time. And so God enters into history. But I think that's an indication of the larger context, that God has always been active in history. Here, the eternal God, who does not change, enters into immutable temporal context. And there's an incredible mystery there, that the second person of the Godhead, who is immutable, becomes man. One last question, and then we'll break. There was a...
Yes, you were saying that one of the benefits of history is it enables you to look at things from a different perspective. And just thinking about the actual writing of history, history that's written now compared to history that's written in the 19th century, maybe something like Broadway. How do you think the spirit of this age, which is postmodern, relativistic, seemingly trying to be very objective, not really up front with our presuppositions, how do you think, particularly in the academic world, that spirit of the age governs history? To what extent is that helpful or not helpful if we read modern historians? Can Christians who are writing history, are they really able to write history as Christians should write?
Yeah, the question then what had to do with how history is written and the differences between maybe history as it was written, say, in the 19th century by people like Merle Daubigny and contemporary historians. This is one of the big issues among evangelical Christian historians today. How should we write history? And so we have a whole school, I think probably well represented by Banner of Truth, the William Grimshaw book by Faith Cook, Ian Murray, who is very well known, his life of Jonathan Edwards and a variety of other works that he's done, is one school of historiography, of writing history, in which it's very, very clear where the author stands theologically. And when he talks about God in the historical narrative, he's not simply talking about God as the subject of the book would talk about God, but he actually is emphasizing that God was active in the ministry of, say, Jonathan Edwards. In the last 25, 30 years, there's arisen a whole school of evangelical historians. Probably the fountainhead is George Marsden, the American historian. People like Mark Knoll, there's a Canadian, George Rawlick, Nathan Hatch, Harry Stout. Here in this country, David Bebbington, who I have enormous admiration for as a historian. David Hempton, the Northern Irish historian. They're all evangelical Christians. And they'll often sometimes announce at the beginning of the book that they have these evangelical convictions, but they have striven to write the book as objectively without their convictions really kind of shaping the narrative in one sense. And so what they're doing is writing history for the academy, the guild of academic historians who don't share their biblical convictions. I think there is a place for that. The problem is, I think that, and the reason I say there is a place for that, think of the book of Esther. History, and yet God's not mentioned in there. But it's intriguing, and it gave the ancient Jewish people at time questions about the canonicity of Esther. However, I think as a Christian, I have a responsibility, yes, to be as objective as I can. So when I hit problems in my subject, so for instance, William Grimshaw, not everything Grimshaw did I would necessarily approve of. Grimshaw sometimes would notice that, as in the congregation, he knew his congregation very well, that some of the young men might be absent. And there was a pub right next door to the St. Michael and All Angels called the Black Bull. It's still there. So sometimes he'd have the people sing Psalm 119. And then he'd go out. He had this huge walking stick with a big knob on the end of it. And he'd go into the pub. And those young men were rounded up and paraded into the church by the force of this man's character. I'm not exactly sure that's a model of pastoral care. So sometimes, you have to recognize that there are going to be at times you're critical of your subject. But having said that, surely as a Christian historian, I have a responsibility to bear witness to what I believe. And I don't think it's enough to say at the beginning in the preface, okay, you need to realize as an evangelical, I'm sympathetic to my subject. And then from that point on, the only time God gets talked about is when my subject talks about him. And so I do share then the concerns of people like Ian Murray, that as far as you can, recognizing that you don't have full understanding of how God was working, say, through the life of Edwards, something needs to be said. Very quickly, there are two biographies that have been written on Edwards, big biographies in the last 25 years. One is Ian Murray's biography, late 80s, and the other is George Marsden's biography. Marsden mentions right in the preface, I'm an evangelical, I share Edwards' views. But then you'll notice he never really ever talks about God acting in the revivals. He'll say, Edwards said this, but he never himself affirms that. You learn all kinds of stuff about Edwards. I'm very interested in details like that. So for instance, Edwards at the end of his ministry ran out of paper, was regularly running out of paper to write on. So he'd write on the back of everything he could find. And a lot of them would be household bills for things they bought. So we have all kinds of knowledge about what kinds of stuff they bought. Well, apparently they bought all kinds of tons of chocolate. I mean, Edwards had 11 kids. They all survived into adulthood. And they ate tons of chocolate. And we've got these bills of them ordering pounds and pounds of chocolate from Boston. I find that fascinating. Murray has none of that. Those little touches that give you the human element. But at the end of the day, I'll never forget a review I read. At the end of the day, in Marsden's biography, you're amazed at Edwards. And Murray's biography, you're amazed at Edwards' God. And which one would Edwards want? Surely it would be that people come away with wonder and love or admiration for the God he served, and not so much wonder about him. So I think there is a place for both, but I think the evangelical Christian historian has to be to some degree up front. He is aiming at a different audience. He wants to impact the academy. The danger of that is this. I'm a Christian. As a historian, I just can't leave that out. We're to do all things to the glory of God. And I've got an opportunity as a historian to write and say things. And so when I write something about Edwards' say, one of his sermons on God, his character, I can indicate the rightness of it by simply an adverb. and Edwards rightly said, or those sorts of things. And I do think we have a duty that we can't ignore. So, thank you.